Crossbreed Game of Thrones with Cinderella, and you'll get Elizabeth Woodville's life story. Despite her lowborn roots, she used her beauty to catch the eye of King Edward IV and become the first common-born Queen of England. Once she had her crown, she'd do anything, and I mean anything, to keep it. Elizabeth Woodville is often seen as an upstart hussy who seduced her way to the top, but modern historians have revealed a much more complicated story. In truth, Elizabeth Woodville wasn't really a peasant queen. On her father's side, she was descended from knights, sheriffs, members of parliament, and other high-powered ancestors. This was nothing to turn your nose at, but back in the 1400s, it was hardly the pedigree that people expected from the future queen of the nation. As the first child of a controversial couple, scandal was in Elizabeth Woodville's blood. Her mother was the widow of King Henry V's younger brother, but when it came time to choose husband number 2, she passed on the royals and wed a mere knight named Sir Richard Woodville. The mismatched couple dropped jaws at the English court and infuriated the king. Elizabeth Woodville's parents were literal outlaws. Her mother had to get permission from the king to remarry, but in her haste to tie the knot, she skipped that step. The king was ticked and promptly fined the newlyweds a hefty €1,000 for getting hitched without his royal blessing. How many other queens of England can you say that their birth was literally against the law? Tudor portraits aren't exactly flattering, but by all accounts, Elizabeth Woodville was hot stuff. She was statuesque with shining blonde hair, fair skin, and entrancing eyes. In a painting of Woodville, they look hazel, but sources describe them as lynx eyes and the eyes of a dragon. Some historians believe that Woodville's eyes were a striking light green or even golden. The 1400s weren't about waiting around. They were about making babies as soon as possible. To do her part, Elizabeth Woodville walked down the aisle when she was just 15 years old and married a knight named Sir John Grey. Soon enough, Woodville won the medieval jackpot and gave birth to 2 sons. However, her wedded bliss wouldn't last very long. During the War of Roses, the Yorks and the Lancasters played an exhausting, bloody game of crown swap. After decades of conflict, the Lancasters lost and King Edward IV took the throne. For the Yorks, this was great, but for Elizabeth Woodville, who was a Lancaster through and through, it was a disaster, and the bad news kept coming. During the final phases of conflict, enemy forces captured her brother and father. Before Woodville and Grey even reached their anniversary, their marriage was already done. Woodville's first husband fought in the brutal Battle of St. Albans, and unfortunately, he didn't make it out alive. With her husband's passing, Woodville became a 28-year-old widow and a single mother. And now, she had to deal with her hellish in-laws all alone. When Grey perished, his parents point-blank refused to help Elizabeth or her children. Although Woodville was promised money in her marriage settlement, her in-laws refused to send her any funds to help her and her children survive. Desperate, poor, and widowed, Woodville only had one option left for survival: betray her family's Lancastrian roots and beg the new king to help her out. Woodville's evil in-laws weren't budging, so to get her money, Woodville had to take her fight to the new king, who was awkwardly her sworn enemy. However, their meeting didn't exactly go according to plan, and in the end, Woodville got a heck of a lot more than she bargained for. She went hoping to receive some help, and left with a wedding ring and a crown. Here's how. How does a single mom meet a guy who will treat her like a queen? In the days before dating apps, all you had to do was stand under an oak tree and wait for the king to ride by. Or at least, that's all it took for Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth used her legendary beauty to catch the king's eye. As Elizabeth explained her plight to the king, he was instantly smitten. In some tellings of their story, Edward meets Elizabeth, immediately falls for her, and insists that she becomes his mistress. Woodville resists the king, advances, and plays hard to get, which obviously leads Edward to become even more obsessed with his new flame. In some other versions of the story, Elizabeth plays her cards so well that she goes from a widow to the queen in just 3 weeks. However, another version of their meeting isn't so romantic. King Edward IV was notorious for getting with a lot of women. So when Woodville resisted him, some sources claim that he responded poorly. Apparently, Woodville had to cry and scream to make him back off before their wedding night. In other versions of the tale, things got even worse. According to some legends, it was actually Edward who wielded a blade against Elizabeth. Apparently, when she refused to go to sleep with him, the king supposedly used intimidation to get his way. Thankfully, a lot of historians believe that this part of the story is just a dramatic embellishment. No matter how they met, here's what we know for certain. It didn't take long for Edward and Elizabeth to make things official. By May 1464, the king and his commoner bride got hitched. When you think of a royal wedding, you think of a lavish and expensive party. But that wasn't the case for Edward and Elizabeth's wedding. It was a really modest affair. You might be asking why. It's because the marriage was top secret. Edward knew that marrying a commoner wouldn't go over well with his advisors. So he threw caution to the wind, had an impulsive Vegas-style wedding, and decided to marry Elizabeth. But unfortunately, this plan didn't go so well. When it came to marriage, Elizabeth's new husband didn't have a very good track record. At the same time Elizabeth married the king, it was rumored that Edward's previous mistress was heavily pregnant and waiting for her marriage to the king. Despite all the messiness and scandal surrounding Elizabeth Woodville's marriage to King Edward IV, her wedding was still straight out of a fairy tale. Before tying the knot, Elizabeth was just your average girl. After, she was the Queen of England. With her marriage, Elizabeth became the first commoner Queen of England, setting the stage for women like Kate Middleton and Meghan Markle. Edward's key advisor, the infamous kingmaker Richard Neville, had been busy setting up a strategic French marriage for the king. Everything was locked and loaded until Edward revealed that actually he couldn't marry a French girl because he'd already eloped with Woodville. Neville didn't like that this made him seem like a lying fool in the eyes of the French court. Angry and embarrassed, Neville would hold a murderous grudge against both the king and Woodville for years to come. Neville wasn't the only one who hated the idea of Queen Elizabeth Woodville. All of the English nobles were ticked. Contemporary accounts called Elizabeth undistinguished, and rumors about Woodville's super seductress ways spread far and wide. The people believed that the king had been led by his regents and that the impulsive match was a huge mistake. And that wasn't all. People really hated Elizabeth. After news of the king's marriage broke, a dark rumor spread through England. It claimed that Edward's wedding didn't count because Edward was illegitimate. The story went that when Edward's mother was in France, she had an affair, and that Edward was the result of that romance, not the queen's marriage to the king. But that's not even the wildest part of the story. The king's mother, the woman whose reputation was being dragged through the mud, did very little to stop it. In fact, some historians believe that she speared the rumor herself, or instructed one of her ladies in waiting to start the gossip. This woman hated Elizabeth so much that she ruined her own reputation and the reputation of her son to get a new daughter-in-law. Everyone hated Elizabeth Woodville, but like it or not, she was the new queen. Edward clearly used the occasion as a way to legitimize his new bride. He hired people to dress as angels, bought Elizabeth an expensive purple gown, and even made London smell okay, which back in the 1400s was a big achievement. Thankfully, all these expenses did the trick. On May 26, 1465, the coronation's pomp and splendor, along with Elizabeth's jaw-dropping beauty, won the people over, for now at least. Elizabeth Woodville's enormous family hitched a ride on her rising star in a big way. The Woodville clan shamelessly used their new fancy pants status as the king-in-laws to ensnare wealthy husbands and wives. Most scandalously, Woodville's 20-year-old brother, John, married the Duchess of Norfolk, who was a whopping 65 years old at the time. This was a power grab, plain and simple, and the Woodvilles were not being subtle about it. Their actions were guaranteed to ruffle feathers at court. Richard Neville felt that his family were the ones who should have been marrying up, not the ambitious Woodvilles. As he watched Elizabeth's family marry up in court, he saw his family's chances to gain power go up in smoke. And then, Elizabeth went too far. Neville's nephew was supposed to nab a wealthy heiress, until Elizabeth pettily stole the girl away and married her off to her own son. With this final insult, Neville officially lost it. In 1470, he lashed out against the royal couple. He partnered up with the King Edward's ambitious younger brother and staged a rebellion to replace King Edward with England's old ruler, Henry VI. While Neville staged his coup, King Edward told Elizabeth to run away and take shelter with her children. Elizabeth got out of Dodge just in the nick of time. After she left, everything devolved. Enemy forces captured Edward, and his commanders lost a major battle. When all was said and done, King Henry VI reclaimed the throne, while King Edward and Elizabeth Woodville lost everything. Unfortunately for Elizabeth, things would get worse before they got better. Richard Neville, the mastermind behind Henry's takeover, made things personal. He declared that Elizabeth and her mother were witches, and that Elizabeth used dark magic to ensnare King Edward IV. Not content with ruining the reputation of Elizabeth and her mom, Neville did something far worse. He captured and beheaded Elizabeth's brother and father. In a matter of months, Elizabeth had gone from the Queen of England to a desperate, grieving mother. In 1470, her husband had been exiled to France, and she had to move into Westminster Abbey to hide from her enemies. As though that wasn't enough for Woodville to deal with, the entire time this mess was going on, Elizabeth was heavily pregnant. Even though her life was a dumpster fire, she persevered and gave birth to a baby boy in the basement of Westminster Abbey. She named her son Edward, and even though she and her husband had technically been deposed, Elizabeth ignored that little detail and thought of the infant as the heir to the throne of England. Little did she know, she was right to get her hopes up. A lot had happened while Elizabeth was locked up in Westminster. By May 1471, King Edward had staged a legendary comeback. He rallied his French allies, persuaded one of Neville's co-conspirators to switch sides, and charged back into England to defeat the infamous Kingmaker. After a decisive victory at Barnet, Edward deposed his competition and reclaimed his crown. Richard Neville, meanwhile, fell off his horse and got trampled, and that was the end for him. With her husband back as king, Elizabeth Woodville re-entered the real-life Game of Thrones. After all Elizabeth's ordeals, she could finally sit back and relax. For the next decade, she spent most of her time doing what all queens had to do: make babies. Although King Edward's womanizing ways meant he was hardly faithful to Elizabeth, the couple had a whopping 10 children, including that all-important heir, Prince Edward. However, as years went by, Elizabeth's experience with motherhood became utterly horrific. Back in the 1400s, queens just had to deal with their husbands having mistresses. But even the most understanding wife would have an issue with what King Edward did. He had 3 major mistresses and plenty of flings on the side, including one rumored relationship with another man, Henry Beaufort. Meanwhile, Elizabeth repaid her husband's affairs with complete loyalty. Even though England was finally peaceful, drama never slept for long in King Edward's castle. This time, the king's brother George was the one causing trouble. He had a tense relationship with the king and the queen. George had betrayed Edward in the past, and he was also a big part of why Elizabeth's father and brother had been executed. George kept trying to marry high-status women in King Edward's court. I say trying because every time he got close to putting a ring on it, Edward and Elizabeth would mess up the match to keep George from getting too powerful. After the royal couple ruined George's love life one too many times, he got extremely angry, left the court, and started scheming against Edward and Elizabeth. As a warning that George should back away, Edward charged some of his brother's friends with a serious offense, using dark magic to destroy both Edward and his heir. Anyone with half a brain would have reined in their schemes at this point, but not George. He kept on keeping on, and in the end, he found himself drowned in a barrel of wine. Historians believe that Elizabeth was in on George's brutal punishment. It was belated payback for his role in the demise of her family. All in all, Queen Elizabeth was a pretty tame traditional queen. She invested heavily in acts of Christian charity and was heavily involved in her children's upbringings. Her days were pretty normal, until once again, everything fell down around her. In 1483, Elizabeth's husband passed under ambiguous circumstances at just 40 years old. His demise left Elizabeth Woodville a widow and a single mother to the future king. During the turbulent 1400s, this was a very dangerous position to be in. Elizabeth knew that to ensure her safety and the safety of her family, she'd have to act fast. In the king's will, Edward appointed his brother Richard to become the Lord Protector of little Prince Edward. Unfortunately, it turns out that Richard was incredibly ambitious. With his big brother out of the picture, he immediately used his new position to grab power for himself. He promised Elizabeth that he'd keep Prince Edward safe, but unfortunately, he lied. After getting his hands on Prince Edward, Richard went to work, destroying the rest of Elizabeth's family. He arrested both her brother and one of her sons from her first marriage, Richard Grey, then suspiciously delayed the coronation of Prince Edward. Sensing that the tides were turning and her entire family would soon be in big trouble, Woodville rushed herself into sanctuary once again. When Richard was no longer satisfied with just abducting the heir to the throne, he turned his eye to the spare as well. His men surrounded the abbey where Elizabeth Woodville was hiding and demanded that she hand over her son. Elizabeth's reaction to this demand has puzzled historians for centuries. Defying all of her maternal instincts, Elizabeth handed over her son. But in Elizabeth's defense, she didn't really have a choice. In most versions of this story, Elizabeth only gave the boy up because she is under extreme duress. So after making the archbishop promise that her son won't be harmed, she reluctantly gave Richard the boy. When Richard defamed somebody, he went hard. He claimed that the priest who married Elizabeth and Edward was a fraud. Thus, their marriage never actually happened. Apparently, Edward would take resistant mistress to a buddy who'd pretend to be a priest and fake marry the couple. Once the girls thought they had a ring, they would share a bed with Edward, who would usually leave soon after. He deposed Prince Edward in 1483, declared himself King Richard III of England, and for good measure, threw in one final reminder that Elizabeth Woodville was a witch. Then, he hurt the ex-queen in the worst way possible. During Richard III's reign, Elizabeth Woodville's life was miserable. She was stripped of her royal title and lands. Her daughters were bastardized, and she would henceforth be known as the Dame Elizabeth Grey, in reference to her first husband. During her time in the sanctuary, she made an unlikely ally. Elizabeth teamed up with her deceased husband's chief mistress, and Elizabeth's own great rival, Jane Shore. With Shore's help, the widowed queen stayed in contact with her allies and plotted an ingenious revenge. Woodville defied everyone's expectations by working with another old enemy, Margaret Beaufort, and trying to bring Richard down. In October of 1483, the woman became involved in Buckingham's rebellion. The plan was stunning. Beaufort's son Henry Tudor would come to England, defeat Richard, take the throne, and marry Woodville's daughter, thus uniting both Yorks and Lancasters. Unfortunately, things didn't go to plan. Richard III caught wind of the rebellion and immediately shut it down. She effectively had to make a deal with the devil, aka Richard himself. Woodville said that if Richard let her and her daughters safely leave the abbey, she wouldn't make any more trouble for him. Richard agreed, but he had one sickening condition. Elizabeth had to live at his court and support his reign. So if Elizabeth wanted to survive, she'd have to play nice with the man who killed her sons. In the end, Woodville and her daughters took Richard's deal. Thankfully, things were about to change in a big way. Henry VII invaded England in 1485, defeated Richard III, and successfully seized the throne. In his victory speech, the new King Henry declared that little Prince Edward was legitimate, then restored Elizabeth Woodville back to her former glory as queen. Henry's kindness to Elizabeth and her kids wasn't purely nice. It was also a way for him to bolster his own power. After all, he stuck to the plan where he'd marry Woodville's daughter, and it wasn't like a king could marry a disgraced woman. By refancying Elizabeth, the new king had also refancied her daughter and, crucially, his future bride. After defeating Richard III, Woodville and her old enemy, Margaret Beaufort, went back to their old ways. They drove each other nuts in a petty battle of queens. Eventually, Beaufort edged Woodville out. After this defeat, the ex-queen got shuttled to yet another sanctuary. After losing her father, brothers, and sons to the violence of court politics, it's not a stretch to imagine that Woodville would welcome some peace and quiet. And so after 55 years of non-stop drama, Elizabeth Woodville's health began to deteriorate, and on June 8, 1942, she finally breathed her last breath. So what do you guys think of the Queen's legacy? Let us know in the comments below and we can have a discussion. But remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.